Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the October 18th meeting of the State Street Advisory Committee. I hope everyone had a good month in that regard. I'm wearing my black today with Dodgers lost twice. And any of you out there who are Atlanta fans, we gave you away 2 games. So looking forward to what happens from here on out. Madam Clerk, could I have a roll call of the board or the advisory committee?
Yes, calling roll, we have Chair Davis,
Here.
Vice Chair Saxon,
Here.
Member Becker,
Mike Becker here.
Member Black,
Here.
Member Blackerby, Member Blackerby, absent, Member Bonderson.
Sorry, I said here, but I thought I must have
Thank you so much.
remuted quickly. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Member Bonderson,
Yes, I'm here. Thank you.
Member Caffarelli,
Here.
Member Durling,
I'm here.
Member Ehrman,
Here.
Member Elander,
Here.
Member Gutierrez, absent, Member Harmon,
Here.
Member Jordan,
Here.
Member Lenvik,
Here.
Member Lewis,
Here.
Member Miller,
Here.
Member Tejada.
Here.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Let's start with some opening remarks and what have you, announcements. We did have correspondence from a Mr. Andrew Rawls, which got sent out to all of you, talking about temporary bathrooms and permanent bathrooms in the long-term master plan. That correspondence obviously had gone to staff. Staff will be basically bringing that back for discussion under the operations and maintenance next month. And we will be talking about that process a little bit later in our agenda. Tess, would you want to tell the committee a little bit about city's plans to move to the Zoom platform? Anything to say in that regard?
Sure. Thank you, Chair Davis. I have a couple announcements I'm hoping to make. So the one is the transition to the Zoom platform. The city is going to be moving to Zoom in November. So this committee will likely have our next meeting on Zoom. It'll either be November or December, but our goal is to have our next one on the Zoom platform. So we'll send out that information shortly. I wanted to just also make the committee aware that we are live streaming this meeting on the city's YouTube channel, and we will be doing that for future meetings. And then you can watch the recordings on City TV in the coming days. They'll re-air. I wanted to just also quickly address the comment we had talked about doing in-person meetings versus remote. We did have council make a determination that boards and commissions will continue to meet remotely to be consistent with what city council is doing. They are going to revisit that every 30 days. And so I will update this committee. I know there's a desire to do in person if the opportunity is there. And so once we have that go ahead, I will let you all know. And then I just wanted to kind of, as an FYI, we have Mr. Colon here today with us, the city attorney. Ms. Ostringer is not available today, but we're happy to have Mr. Colon. And then I just quickly wanted to just make the group aware that we are going to have a brief update with at City Council on November 16th on the progress for the State Street Advisory Committee and just what we've been doing over the last couple meetings. So if you're interested, I'll remind you again, the next meeting that we have, it'll be the day after our next meeting. And then for me, just one other, I just wanted to, it was nice to see some of you all during the housing day. So great to see those of you that were there. And then I've met with many of you and looking forward to meeting with the rest in the coming weeks. And I really enjoyed that one-on-one opportunity to get to know all of you. And I encourage you to do the same with other committee members as well.
Great.
That's it for me, Chair Davis.
Good, thank you so much for that update. That takes us to the agenda review, and again, you've had a chance to look at the agenda. Today's meeting basically is really going to focus on the master plan scope and key elements to the RFP, RFQ process. That's really the bulk of what we're going to talk about today, and as you saw in the draft PowerPoint, the time schedule is essentially we'll be doing this State Street Master Plan scoping over the next 2 to 3 months. It's at least through December in that regard. We will also talk about the interim operations and management process, which we'll get into next month and basically spend the next 3 months on that. And again, Tess will take us through that an overview of that particular process, not really in detail today because the key staff people that we need in the room here to talk about that are not available for this month. And then we'll talk about the potential agenda items for the future. We'll go from there. We have the next item, item C, is the approval of the minutes from the September 22nd, 2021 meeting. Are there any questions or comments from anyone on that set of minutes? Not seeing anyone raising their hand. Do I have a motion from anyone to approve the minutes? There was somebody making a motion somewhere in there. Try again.
I'll make a motion if no one else cares to do that.
There you go. I have a motion from commission or committee member Landvik and a second from
Roger.
Roger. Second from Roger. We'll take that. Okay. Madam Clerk, could we have a roll call on that?
Yes, we have Member Becker,
The alternates don't vote. Okay.
thank you,
Farrelly and Becker don't vote.
thank you. Member Black,
Abstain.
Member Blackerby,
Aye.
Member Bonderson,
I have to abstain since I wasn't here last time.
Member Durling,
Roger votes yes.
Yes.
Member Ehrman,
Aye.
Member Elander,
Yes.
Member Gutierrez is not present. Member Harmon,
Yes.
Member Jordan,
Yes.
Member Lenvik,
Yes.
Member Lewis,
Abstain?
Member Miller,
Aye.
Member Tejada,
Aye.
Chair Davis,
Aye.
and
Aye.
Vice Chair Saxon.
Yes.
The consent calendar is approved with 3 abstentions, unanimously approved with 3 abstentions. That then takes us to general public comment. This is general public comment for anything within our purview, which is not being discussed directly on the agenda today. Madam Clerk, do we have anyone who wishes to speak under general public comment at this time?
Just a quick reminder, if you are interested in making a public comment, use the raise hand icon on your computer screen. I'll call on you and you will have 2 minutes to speak. And there are no members of the public who have raised their hand. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. That takes us into item A, the master plan scope and key elements. First item, subsection I, is discussing other master plan examples in State Street master plan scoping. Now, there are a lot of us here, and we're probably, hopefully, we're going to have lots of comments from people. So Tess and I will basically try to keep you guys in line so we don't go too far. But Tess, you want to lead this discussion?
Great,
Take
thank
it
you,
away.
Chair Davis. All right, nice to see you all. So feel free to jump in and ask questions as I go through this presentation. There's a lot of material here, so I'm gonna go quickly, but I do want you to feel free to jump in, whether I call on you or not. Just feel free to unmute yourself and chime in. So this presentation, I'm hoping to get a shared understanding of what we envision the State Street Master Plan scope to really look like, and to also talk about the RFP or RFQ process ahead of us. So we're going to start with discussing some planning examples and the scope of the master plan. And I want to start out by turning it over to all of you to ask take the next 20 minutes or so and ask the question, what city or street did you review over the last month if you did have an opportunity to do that? And then what did you learn from the plan that you looked at? And is there anything in particular that you want to share with the group? Either something really compelling or interesting or something you hope we consider moving forward. So if anybody has, I'm going to go through some examples afterwards, but I'd love to hear from whoever has looked at a city or street, and we'll go from there.
Don't everybody speak up, it's Diane.
I
actually went through quite a few, probably not in as much detail as some people might have chosen to do. And the ones that really stood out to me, the first one was Miami Beach and Lincoln Road. And the reason I liked that particular plan, it was super detailed, but I liked it because it had 8 blocks of closure. And then it was flanked by several streets that weren't closed between the ocean and the bay. So it had a mix of pedestrian and vehicular. It just seemed the closest to the extent of our plan. I liked that they had a huge number of visitors every day and that 2/3 of them were local. So they made a point of saying only about 37% were visitors and 63 were local, which kind of feeds into our some of our comments about the plan really being designed toward locals, and it'll pull in other people as well. I like the fact that they chose civic anchors. I mean, they probably had shopping anchors as well, but they really focused on civic anchors. And I thought their reference to a cohesive design vocabulary really spoke to Santa Barbara and what we typically do in design. So I really liked that one. And then I looked at 3 others. I don't want to go through all of them because I'll dominate all the time. But the other one that I thought was really interesting was Burlington, Vermont. And it was actually a very huge plan area. I don't think they had any street closures. So it didn't compare to Santa Barbara in that way. But I liked their extensive community outreach. I liked their focus on housing and equity issues. It seemed like that plan was far more than just a design plan, which some of them mainly focused on. So those were the 2 that I particularly was interested in. Also looked at City of Boulder and Santa Monica, but we can talk about those as they come.
Great, thank you.
Good. Robin.
Hi, everyone. Great to see you. I looked through all of the plans that were recommended by Tess with the exception of Miami because for whatever reason, the link wasn't working on my page. But the ones that kind of some of the things that stood out to me, I noticed that quite a number of them focused on 24 hours of kind of activity or a plan for a 24-hour district in their downtown. A lot of them had focus on alley access for loading and unloading, wayfinding elements. This is particular to San Luis. I thought the photovoltaic shade structures were pretty interesting. That several of them had walking tours to engage the residents to look at all of the different spaces and speak about them in their outreach plan. I really like Santa Monica's focus on art and making immediate visible improvements as well as kind of the longer term ones. I thought Burlington's was interesting because it involved not only a climate focus, but also local food focus and also local food distribution in their plan. I thought that was pretty innovative. And a couple focuses on creative catalyst projects that were interesting. And then lastly, I thought the Modesto plan was the only one that I saw that really pointed out all of the different funding sources that they were considering using. So I wanted to make sure that that was highlighted. Thank you.
Great, thank you.
Great.
Yes, Mr. Saxon.
Good. Then Peter.
Thanks. Good to see you all. I looked at all the plans, but I was intrigued at two different ends of the spectrum to me. On the one end, really comprehensive and unique was the Burlington plan, and on the other end of the spectrum was the Santa Monica plan, which seemed to me to be like a market study, repositioning. Obviously, one took a number of years, the Burlington one, and the Santa Monica one was quicker. So some of the things that I appreciated in the Burlington plan was the extent and the creativity of the public engagement processes was really interesting. They had all kinds of ways to engage the public, including they had a speaker series, and I also like that they included the historic context and other things that are very, very Burlington centric, so that plan doesn't look like anybody else's plan. It's really grounded in what is unique in the history and place of Burlington. And also they used infographics really well, which is another excellent communications tool that I appreciated. In Santa Monica's plan, on the other end, I appreciated that in a short period of time they came up with a few clear strategies that it seemed to me that had the potential to increase the economic vitality in that space.
Great. Peter.
Thank you.
So I also looked at Burlington and had some of the same impressions as Ken did. And the only other takeaway I had in addition to the Burlington was they seem to really promote or be focused on the local economy and locals. And I think we need to do the same. I think if we can be successful there, we're going to be successful with the tourists. The other thing at Burlington that really struck me is how they emphasized that it needed to be clean, safe, inviting, pedestrian experience, and quality lighting. And I think all of those we need as well and need to be satisfied. The other thing I looked at was Boulder, and I happened to be in Boulder 2 weeks ago. So it was kind of instructive to have been there before I read this urban study guidelines. And one of the takeaways I learned from Boulder was it's only 4 blocks long. It's a smaller downtown. They don't allow bikes in that 4 blocks. That really struck me. And I thought they did it successfully. And I'm a biker, so I've been very pro biker, but it was something that made me question my assumptions. And it's just super inviting, those 4 blocks, easily walked. There's no curbs, so access to the stores for delivery is done through a meandering vehicular, but unnoticed unless you really look down to realize that that's what it's for. So it solves another problem on State Street that's very critical to keep in mind. And it wasn't overly programmed. I did look at Miami briefly, and that seemed very programmed to me. And what I liked about Boulder is, and it's in their guidelines, is it's not overly programmed. There's not a ton of stuff. You can see retail stores. You can, there's not parklets that have roofs and are obstructing views. It just feels light and airy. And lastly, I would say the other thing in that guideline that I thought was really good is they want uniformity in the sidewalks. And perhaps our biggest problem in my view today on State Street is a very highly variable sidewalk width. So every block ends up with these totally different personalities. And it just doesn't work for me. And I don't think it works for most tenants. And I think we want something more cohesive.
Great, thank you. Yes, Nadra. And
You want to make a comment there, Tess?
yes, I do. So Nadra actually, she really went above and beyond, and she picked a couple that I did not send out, and provided me with some information, a presentation really, and a summary of some of her key takeaways. So I want her to share a little bit of that with us right now, but I'm going to go ahead and send the document to all of you later so you can get a sense for a little more detail for some of the cities that she looked at.
Thank you, Tess. Yeah, so I got really into this. So I wanted to look at cities. I did some searches on cities that were considered like the best cities in the world. And so, you know, there's a lot of different lists, but from those lists, I decided to go with Copenhagen, Denmark, which is in Europe, and then also Austin, Texas. So just a quick highlight, the items that stuck out to me for Denmark is they're really socially orientated, they're creatively focused, they're sustainably innovative, and they have a functional simplicity in their design. And they really focus, like when I say socially oriented, just really focusing on interpersonal relationships and interactions and the way they design their spaces, looking at creativity as a brand and actually having creativity as a part of their economic development model. And then in terms of that functional simplicity, having merging the functionality simplicity with a human-oriented design. And I may be saying this wrong, but they have this Stroget, which is it's 1.1 kilometers, and it's the world's longest pedestrian street. I know that we don't have the capability for anything like that, but just that kind of innovation in terms of design really struck out to me. They really focus, kind of funny how Peter was saying that in Boulder they don't do bikes, but they're really heavy on bikes as transportation. And their goal is to have a third bikes, third public transportation, and no more than a third of car transportation. So I thought that was also very interesting. They have a very robust sustainability model where they have their goal to be carbon neutral by 2025. They have a climate resiliency plan that works on investing and sewer capacity and in building dikes, retrofitting old buildings, and 22% of their energy is from wind turbines. I know we don't have that capability right here downtown, but again, just looking at some of the innovative ideas that they have, also preserving green spaces and looking at density. And so using the existing buildings that they have and then building around that instead of looking at sprawl. And then also looking at housing. Again, this is, they have a socialist democracy, but 43% of all their rent dwellings are part of some social housing program. And they are committed to housing for all, highlighting that everyone from like having affordable housing for all people is a tenement of a strong community. And then they have an innovative future housing project, which is 62,000 square feet that mixes residential with with commercial, so mixed use plan. So then that was, I'm trying to go through this fast because there was a lot of information, so sorry. And then the second one was Austin. And what really stood out to me in Austin is something that we've kind of talked about, is the idea of shared values, vision, and guidelines. So they based their whole plan on 11 values, and the values include human character, density, sustainability, diversity, economic vitality, civic art, a sense of time, character, authenticity, safety, and a connection to the outdoors. And so every single, and then they separated the plan between wide urban spaces, public streetscapes, plazas, open spaces, and buildings. And every different section and every had, I would say 11 to 16 segments within those sections. And every single segment had a value, multiple values associated with it. So, and it helped to really make the plan cohesive. And then lastly, and then they did talk about like wayfarers in terms of making sure that, people were able to get to every section easily and that they blended together really well. And also, Austin, Texas, they really highlighted civic art too as a very important aspect of their city, and density as well. And then just the last one was Zurich, Switzerland. They have this very cool concept of a digital twin, which is a 3D model of that's a virtual representation. So it helps them figure out that they use simulations and machine learning to basically figure out different modeling for environment, energy, urban planning, etc. So I just thought that that was something very innovative for this type of plan. So
thank you, Nadra.
Megan.
Thank you. Nadra, that's very fascinating. I'm really excited to see what gets sent out. Thank you. And a lot of folks have already said sort of what I've thought about these plans, but I also wanted to share that when I thought about this assignment, I thought about it in a little bit of a different way as well, thinking about non-Western cities that I've lived in that had pedestrian promenades. So particularly thinking about Cairo, thinking about Beirut, and thinking about Jerusalem. And interesting for me, obviously these were not master planned in the way that we're talking about master planning our state street, or they have been master planned over millennia. But one of the things that really stood out to me in all of these cities that have pedestrian only areas is the integration of functional life with attractions for outsiders or tourists. So in all of these places, there's very dense housing for families, for residents incorporated within sort of the heart of the pedestrian area. And so along with that comes all of the ancillary requirements of functional life. So there will be a farm stand for food right next to a place to buy beautifully decorated ceramic plates. And I think that integration of real life with something that's attractive for outsiders is what stands out to me as being sort of most exciting about those areas, and most exciting as an outsider as well to go in and experience real life in those cities, and to not feel that you're just having a tourist experience when you go into the old city of Jerusalem, for example. So that's something that I really like about those areas, and the way that it feels organic and not, certainly master planning is obviously why we're here, and we're here to plan it out. But to allow for some element of whimsy into this, I think is key to creating something that doesn't feel quite so forced. And so that's just really what I want to point out, and also just hope that we can consider some non-traditional sources of inspiration as well, and not to forget the non-Western world, for example, because I think there's a lot that we can learn from communities that have been doing this for far, far longer than we have. So, thank you.
Thanks. Hillary, followed by Michael.
Thank you. This is a fun discussion. Nadra gets A+ for creating her own presentation. Tough act to follow there. So the one I delved into the most, I took a look at, I think all of them, but was the San Luis Obispo. One thing, I won't belabor or repeat the points that have been already made, but I liked that their planning principles and goals. I liked the way that those were laid out. One that stood out to me that I'm like, why don't we just steal this wholesale? was 2.2 on their principles, which was plentiful and safe public spaces. They said, provide opportunities for positive social interaction, quiet moments, and access to the natural environment where everyone feels safe and welcome. I thought that was so nice and important. And as we think about our public spaces and public amenities and seating and, restrooms and things like that, making sure that people are able to interact, have, quiet moments I thought was really nice, and then access to the natural environment and feeling safe and welcome. So I really appreciated that. I liked that. One thing that I think was sort of missed opportunity in their plan was they talked about enhanced mobility, which is great, talking about walkability, pedestrians, bicyclists, and transit riders, but it was not very specific on most of those things. And it was the only transit piece was like collaborating on a new transit center, which is great, but it really has nothing to do with actual circulation. And then right after that, they talked about universal accessibility, but not really about how people could get around more than just as pedestrians. So I think being very specific about mobility and accessibility, and those together and apart, are important. And then in the Modesto plan, I liked actually how a lot of it was laid out with all the different sort of existing conditions type stuff that they did. So parking facilities, one-way streets, bike network, transit network, all the different, we could do paseos, all those different things, laying out the context was really important. And I liked the way that everything sort of flowed in that plan. The Burlington one, I think there's good plan, but they say very explicitly, we did it like a magazine. And to me, that's just like kind of too much and hard to read as far as an actual document. But last week, I actually took a vacation. I was in New York, DC, and Philadelphia, and walking around and staying with people who live in, neighborhoods where people live, not at hotels. And so I've been thinking a lot about this. Unfortunately, I didn't wind up at any place that had a pedestrian promenade, but just thinking about how people get around, what's close to them, what their needs are, and what's missing and what works. So I've after reading these plans and then going to places that I don't live, I was thinking about it both from a visitor's perspective, but also as I was with the people I was staying with who live there, thinking about it from their perspective and asking them about how they get around and what works and what doesn't. So this is exciting, and thanks to Tess for sharing all these different ones.
Great, thank you.
Sorry, actually, one more thing I forgot. I think what I want to know about a lot of these is how did it go? Some of these are from 2015, 2017 or earlier. I think it'd be great to find out from the people there, even just, city staff, like, well, so did it work? Did you implement any of this? Is it still sitting on a shelf? Are you waiting for money? Because a plan can look great, but if nothing happened, or they're like, wow, well, this was the huge mistake we made, don't make this mistake. Let's find out what those were so we don't fall in the same one. And then the thing that I didn't notice in a lot of these that I know conversations have been had in our community, but within the downtown, thinking about little like sub districts, right? So the theater district and things like that. I didn't really see a good example of kind of sub areas explained in these. Maybe that's just not how it was there. So anyway, that's something I'm interested in seeing in our plan. Thanks.
Great, thank you.
Thanks. Alejandra's joined us. Hi there, Alejandra. Thanks for joining us. We're going
Hello,
around the room and
everyone.
we're talking about the plans that we reviewed during the week. And I think I got Michael next and Roxanne after Michael.
Yeah,
Michael.
thank you, Chair. And I appreciate getting to follow Hillary because I worked in Philadelphia for 8 years and I kind of picked the areas on the East Coast I didn't pick anywhere that has a pedestrian promenade. I was more focused on places where people live and have a downtown, yet they're also visited by lots of tourists or other types of visitors. So I chose Annapolis, Maryland, the Old City District of Philadelphia, which is the area around Independence Hall, Betsy Ross House, and so forth. Westchester, which is a small suburban town outside of Philadelphia. And I really, really wanted to look at Brooklyn Heights, which is a neighborhood in New York City. The most inviting, beautiful town. You don't feel like you're in New York City when you're in Brooklyn Heights, but unfortunately I couldn't find a master plan for that. So I'll be brief, a couple points, a lot of, attracting neighborhoods, serving retail, connecting to neighborhoods, great public places. There was the Old City District for Philadelphia had a quote, which I thought was, I wrote it down, I thought it was relevant. It said, Paris builds parks for Parisians and tourists love them. Philadelphia builds parks for tourists and Philadelphians hate them. Which I think kind of gets to our point is, try and make a downtown for Santa Barbara. And if we love it, the tourists will too. The one thing that I would bring up is in Westchester, which you're probably not familiar with it, but a great little downtown, very walkable, lively. Their master plan really kicked so much stuff down the road that I didn't feel was useful. It was like, study this, analyze that, where it leaves too much to the future, too much to interpretation. And I think that it would be in our interest to try and answer some of those questions as we go through this process. And one last point before I pass it on, but I believe it was in the Westchester one, I talked about trying to capitalize on its strengths. And it made me think too, that perhaps it's an exercise that we could go through and help inform the RFP is to do a SWOT analysis. What are the strengths of the state's Lower Street corridor now? What are the opportunities, threats, and weaknesses? And then we know essentially what do we want to build on, what do we want to try and mitigate, and so forth. But I thought that was beneficial.
Great. Good. Thank you so much. Roxana. Hi.
Hello. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have a couple of cities that I also want to share with you today that I actually have lived in. And I feel like because they're cities that ultimately accomplish everything that we've been asked to look at, I was going to present it from a person's point of view who actually lived right in the heart of the city. The first two are both in Italy. One is in Florence and one is in Rome. The first one in Florence is Via dei Calzaioli, which is the main strip of pedestrian space that's close to vehicles, and it runs between their Duomo, their cathedral, and their main political center, which is Piazza della Signoria. And unlike Santa Barbara, they have more of a blocked grid space in downtown. Therefore, they have more than one parallel. However, that's their main parallel. What I appreciate about it, why it reminds me in some ways about what Santa Barbara is trying to accomplish, is obviously their dense housing, the pedestrian area, and the fact that right in the heart of the city, they have shops for locals that allow people to live right there, just run downstairs, buy a loaf of bread, get their groceries, get their whatever they need. And then, but it's also the heart for the tourists. And it has shopping. It's focused on different districts. You have the art district. You have local artists as well, crafts. You have marketplaces where people either sell textiles or clothing or art or food. You have all these activities just hustling and bustling right downstairs, and yet people live there and they can live there without too much difficulty. They also have small side alleyways, which reminds me a lot about some of those tiny little half block alleys that we have in Santa Barbara, for lack of a better word, these tiny little plaza walkways like the Victoria Court or the Arcata here in Santa Barbara. So it reminds me a lot of those. I wanted to bring that one up. The next one is in Rome. And there's actually two in Rome, but the one I really want to focus on is Via del Corso. And that is a lot longer of a road. It runs between Piazza Venezia and Piazza del Popolo, which it's ultimately a shopping street. And it has outdoor dining. It has, of course, shops. It's highly, highly dense area for living. But the reason I wanted to bring this one up is because one of the things that I find to be very important, they do it very well, is they have many, many access points for individuals to be able to get there by car, by taxi, by bus stops, by even metro stops. And what that tells me is that it's accessible for all people. If somebody can't get there by walking or biking, they have other options. And it's really important that there are other options when we talk about what we're looking for here in Santa Barbara in the future. The other example I wanted to share was Frankfurt in Germany. They have a lot of outdoor walking pedestrian areas. And the one in particular is the Zeil. And if anyone's ever been there, the interesting thing about it, and the reason it reminds me of Santa Barbara, is that it has opportunity for a lot of different things. There's obviously shops. Don't be distracted that it is a skyscraper kind of city. There is a lot of older areas in Frankfurt that have been preserved with lower heights. But the reason that this particular area triggered my interest to share today is because it has these shops, it has the outdoor dining, but it has a variety of outdoor dining. It's not just fancy restaurants like parklet kind of sitting areas. It has ice cream shops, it has coffee shops, it has delis, it has beautiful fancy restaurants that might be open all year long, even if the weather is poor. They have very cold weather at times. But they also have entertainment. They have opportunities to set up art, which it was never lost on me. Music. They have entertainment and entertainers, but they also have places to sit that has nothing to do with buying something. You could just go sit with your friends and sit for hours and just people watch, or bring your own lunch and have your lunch outside on a picnic bench. They have a lot of like water elements or art elements that are just part of that walking space. And lastly, that hot topic that I wanted to share that was similar to Via del Corso is the fact that there's a lot of cross streets that they've allowed to stay open. That's really similar to Santa Barbara, with State Street having all the cross streets remaining open, because it gives opportunities for access. There's buses that run by, there's trams, there's taxi stops. In their case, they also have the U-Bahn, the underground, which we don't have here, but they are a very, very highly bike-friendly community, and you'll see bikes everywhere. It's a really big way for people to get around in Frankfurt. But the reason I thought it was very important to share was because the bikes do not share the pedestrian walking spaces. There's no conflict with bikes whizzing past people who are walking. They're extremely, extremely respectful of where the bikes are indicated to be. They have their own very safe, very controlled network. So it's safe for bicycles to share the roads, but it's also very safe for the pedestrians not to be concerned with having bikes on their sides. And so I'll just wrap up by saying that I can share this with you, Tess, if you like. I have another street in Rome. And also the most obvious one, I'm surprised nobody's said yet, but maybe somebody's coming up next with Las Ramblas in Barcelona. That one was actually the #1 urban street that we were required to learn, study, and work with in urban design school. It came up every year with every course that we took. And so I think that if we don't already have that on our list to study, we should. And if you would like me to provide anything, I'm happy to, but I won't take your time now because I'm sure other people may want to talk about it. So thank you. That's
Thank you.
Who's next? Kristen.
I just have a very short one because mostly what I want to say is, I love what everybody has said. I agree with all of it. You've all pointed out many of the same notes I took. The only thing I have to add is that with Boulder in the chamber world, we have benchmarked Boulder a number of times because we do have some similarities in our economies and our economic development. So similarities with entrepreneurship, university, tourism, and striving to retain a strong industrial core nearby. So I don't know if that matters, that then we're also trying to have a downtown similar to the, or we could look at elements in their downtown, maybe that connects with us, I'm not sure, but I also liked their plan. And I would just comment, as others have, on the Burlington plan, with there being a good focus on economic development. What are the economic engines that pay for getting all of this done?
Great. Good. Anybody else before we move on? Great, we had a lot
All
of
right.
cities here. I was gonna throw in Rome also, but just because of the piazzas and the public spaces that are there. Istanbul, if you ever walk down the Istiklal in the middle of the day, it's like incredible. And then I was gonna bring up Santa Barbara. You know that place? Hal Conklin, if he was still around, my good friend Hal Conklin, he talked about this place. This is back in the 80s. The Santa Barbara had a sense of place, a sense of history, and a sense of celebration. You could take those three characteristics and values, place it on any one of these plans, and you'll find that those core things are the plans that you love. And when we come back and we're talking about our plan, I'm going to always come back to, are we validating it as a sense of place, history, and celebration? So with that, Tess.
Great. Thanks so much, Dave. And thanks to all of you. And the point really for that is for us to really start to think about what things we like from other cities or other streets, also to recognize that streets and cities are very different in their makeup. The plans are very different. And from a 35-page plan to a 200-page plan, you get real variety in terms of how much is being discussed. So I'm just going to go through in the next 10 minutes some of the examples that I shared with you and that have been shared, just to get into a little bit more detail. And then we're going to talk about the scoping effort for the master plan for State Street. All right, so the first one's Burlington. This is a 4-block street on Church Street. The photo on the left is from the, I believe, 70s or early 80s, and then the photo on the right is current day. So this just gives you another view of Church Street. Just looking at the photo, you can see that the street includes a variety of things. It has street vendors and outdoor dining. As I was reviewing the street, I also noticed that it is programmed occasionally, used for things like exercise classes and other events. And then it has sculptures throughout and murals either on the street or around the corners. Just interesting that I thought was worth noting. And then this downtown master plan was created in 2013. Like some of you have mentioned, one of the big components here was public engagement. They did take a different approach in having more of a magazine format, but I thought their public engagement aspect was probably one of the better ones of the examples that I shared. One of the other things I just wanted to mention in this one is that stormwater management was highlighted probably more than most of the other examples. And then they divided up into 7 different areas with really conceptual plans or ideas for what could be changed and what the potential benefit could be. So this is an example here. The right-hand side is from the plan itself. It's hard to see, but if you can see my cursor, this area kind of right by the church is all grass right now, and it extends to the right. So there's a proposal in the master plan to do some redevelopment to enclose the space a little bit, and then to also formalize this central area to provide things like benches sort of throughout. They have an agricultural component. So what you see right here in this green space is actually like a garden for food. And then they've got different lighting components. They have different awning elements. But you can just see that they've taken the space and tried to think of different ways to get more people on the street. This one is Lincoln Road in Miami. And as it was mentioned, it is the most similar from the examples to State Street in that it is 8 blocks. It's about a mile long, which is almost just about the length of the closure of State Street currently from Victoria to Haley Street, which is, I believe, is about 0.8 miles. So this one here at the bottom, this one was done, consultant was James Corner Field Operations, who also did the High Line in New York City. And these photos here are from the plan itself, so showing what an existing portion of the street looked like versus the proposed on the right-hand side. They set up the plan into different strategic approaches and then pilot projects. And this one in particular, as mentioned, really focused on design elements. So they went block by block and looked at different components for each block. They also looked at, when I'm saying design elements, they looked at things like cafe organization and infrastructure, paving, planter walls and seat walls, additional furnishing, streetscape elements and wayfinding, and had pretty specific detail on each of those things. This just shows another example of existing versus proposed, using what they're calling the Euclid stage as an area for people to get together. And then this just shows one of the design element components. This is sort of the detail that was provided in this plan. So you can see that they really outlined different spaces for different uses. And then this is just the paving portion, but they've identified what particular paving they want to use to differentiate the different spaces. This is probably the most granular, the most detail of the examples that I sent out. It's pretty heavy on design. It is missing the financial component that at least one, I believe it was the Modesto plan had, which might be something to consider. So we're now going to go over to 3rd Street Promenade, and it is a little bit different. The plan is an economic vitality plan. This one was done in June of 2021. 3rd Street was opened in the late 80s, 1989. And they've talked about a revitalization effort, or Promenade 3.0, which is a plan to redesign 3rd Street by 2026. I believe the proposal is about $40 to $60 million to do that redesign. Getting a little bit of feedback, so if you're not muted, if you don't mind muting, that would be great. And so they actually started, what I thought was kind of interesting here is they started with something called the experiment, where they allowed designers to come up with different temporary elements like lawn games or boxes for climbing on, or outdoor stage components. And the idea was to test how people use the space and use that information as a basis for redesign. They also are looking at doing some rezoning for a lot of the retail spaces because the spaces are larger, and considering making them smaller to allow for smaller retail businesses to come in and use the space. So this one's set up a little bit differently. They have, I believe, 7 or 8 strategies and then actions by which to get at each strategy. So as an example, one of them is to create rooftop hangouts and underground hideaways. And the action there is to support restaurants and other businesses on rooftops and balconies, encourage the use of basement spaces for special performance spaces and entertainment uses. And that's just one of many. This plan is the shortest of the plans and is probably higher level than the others. It's just showing an example of some of the things that they did in the interim. So they put out on the left-hand side, those are public tables and chairs for anybody to use. On the right-hand side is a teeter-totter that was put in the middle of the street with the idea that anybody could go ahead and use it. The next one is Pearl Street in Boulder. One's a little bit different because it's not really a master plan. It was, Pearl Street was designed in the 60s, and the community got together and decided to close down this four block area. What I thought was interesting is the property owners assessed themselves about 2/3 of the cost to build the mall back in 1976. One of the things that's interesting for Pearl Street that existed from the beginning is this idea of play spaces. So on each street, There is a fairly discrete play space for children and families. You'll see on the left, one is boulders. There's also a small child sculpture area, and then there's a water play area as well. And then on the right-hand side, you just see that they've incorporated different things like they have a kind of more manicured landscaping that changes depending on the season. They also have sculptures on each block. They have a large restroom in the center. I believe it's on the second block that's open to anybody there. And then City Hall is kind of right off Pearl Street if you're not familiar with the location, and they have a creek about 2 blocks on the other side and have various transportation throughout. This is just another glimpse at the street. They use the street for a variety of activities. They've got music festivals, particularly in the summer, I believe. And then just lots of seating throughout the mall as well, which is interesting. This one just a little bit different. The Champs-Élysées in Paris. This is one that just came out in January. It's a 10-year plan for Paris to really transform the most famous avenue there into kind of a new urban living environment. So the Champs-Élysées currently they've estimated about 85% of the people on the street as visitors. And then the remaining as people that work on the street, and only about 5% of Parisians actually utilizing the streets. The idea is to try to transform it to be more of an urban space that residents can utilize. And so this proposal features an operational framework defined by 5 urban layers. So they're looking at nature, infrastructure, mobilities, uses, and buildings. And they're really focusing on making it more pedestrian friendly. So one of the things that the mayor has pledged to do is to plant hundreds of thousands more trees across the capital, with 50% of the city being covered by 2030. They're also planning to reduce the car use, so going from 4 lanes, I believe, to 2 lanes, and encouraging travel on foot and public transport. Just another view of the proposed plans as well, just to get a sense for what different cities are doing. And then I wanted to just quickly touch on the San Luis Obispo plan and the Modesto plan. So those are just examples of other plans as well. Maybe I'll focus on the Modesto one that was done by Opticos. They have a variety of design principles that they focused on, but the thing that I really liked from that plan was the implementation component. They have a separate implementation plan where they talk about downtown revitalization and economic growth. They have a strategy for utility improvements and downtown parking for how those things are going to get built. And then they have a really kind of specific section on funding and financing the improvements that they're proposing, and then a summary of the major downtown projects. That plan's a little bit different in the sense that it's really a visioning plan looking to the future for the entirety of downtown Modesto, but I do think the implementation piece is pretty interesting there. And then San Luis Obispo did have I thought one of the interesting ones, it was not super specific, but there was a block by block description for each of the blocks that they looked at. And so they went through and identified different things that could change or different opportunities for redevelopment on each block. There's lots of other examples. Just earlier this afternoon, I had come across the Hollywood Walk of Fame as well, which is getting redesigned. It's about a mile long, or a little over a mile long. That one's being done, I believe, by Gensler. And they're looking at going to more of a pedestrian space. So going from 4 lanes down to 2 lanes, creating more landscaping, more public areas for use. So lots of tables and chairs, things like that. So any questions before we move on from there? Okay. All right. So we're gonna, oh yes.
Yes. I just had a comment. I'm sorry. First of all, I'm a little loopy. I just had a 3rd shot, and I have all the side effects because of the 3rd Pfizer shot. one of the things that I noticed in all, and I think I mentioned when you and I met one-on-one, one of the things that I noticed in all the examples that you sent is that Santa Barbara, we have an issue that it's a straight street, and it was mostly designed to get people to mobilize, not so much to linger. You know, it's just traffic in and out. And all of the examples that you sent us, whether it's Santa Monica, Burlington, et cetera, they have created an environment that encourages curiosity, exploration, and people to linger, which right now, as enticing and beautiful Santa Barbara is, we don't have that. It's all about in and out, go up and down the street, but not engaging the brain and the sight into exploring and lingering and discovery. And that's something that whatever we decide to do, we definitely have to keep that in mind.
It's a great point, Roger. Yeah. I mean, what I think one of just from going to different places and looking at different cities, what I've noticed, especially in the ones that are currently doing a redesign, 2020, 2021, that are either right around the pandemic as well, is really designing for space. For people are wanting to get outside of their homes or home environment and meet people in a different setting, whether that be a park or a downtown street. It's not necessary, the businesses are certainly going to provide an aspect of it, but the businesses themselves can't be the only thing that's driving people to the downtown core. So really thinking about what is it that would bring you down. And that's why I tried to show some of the more whimsical things like 3rd Street with the teeter-totter or the play space area in Boulder, just to give the idea that people like to congregate around things, around stores and shops and restaurants, but also around spaces. And how do we think about the space as more than just the street that we have today? So just to start to get you to really think that through.
Tess, Alejandra had a question relative to when the AIA's charrette items may come in, and I responded to her that when we get into our particular plan, those will be major inputs into the process. I saw Roxana raise her hand, and then somebody else jumped in too. Roxanne, go ahead, Roxana.
Thank you so much. One of the things that Ms. Harris triggered in my thoughts and the question that she was responding to was that idea of curiosity. And one of the things that came up in the research that I didn't share it, but I would love to add it here, is with Rome and with Florence. One of the things that always captured my attention when I lived there and came up again in my research is that they have these linear accesses between these points, which is very similar to what we have in Santa Barbara. But that idea of curiosity, it happens along the path, whether it's an activity that is intentionally designed into the experience, or because there's things happening along the way around the corner that might capture your peripheral vision. And when you experience some of those cities, one of the ways that I think it can translate into what we have here in Santa Barbara is that we have a lot of beautiful little alleyways or plazas right off of State Street. For example, De La Guerra Plaza, where City Hall is, or the La Arcada, or just the little inlets of Paseo Nuevo. So as somebody is walking down the street, there are places that are already developed. There are places that are already quite lovely, but they're off of what we're talking about, off of State Street. And I think that with a little bit further research, we can find how other cities are successfully using that draw, that curiosity, that design element into not only developing the main street, but how they're expanding the experiences and pulling people not just straight through that linear experience, but also with these detours to the edges and to the sides, around the corners. I think it's a really great idea, thought that was brought up, and I appreciate how Ms. Harris responded to it. I was going to say, if that is something that may be of interest, we can do a little bit more research on that as well.
So somebody else that wanted to comment, but I didn't see a hand. Somebody else commenting before that?
Yeah, it was me.
Yeah,
Okay.
Go ahead, Marge.
I just, to Roger's point, which I think is very important, you know, Lincoln Road in South Beach, Miami, you know, the closure of that really created lots of opportunities. And one of the things that was built was New World Symphony, which Michael Tilson Thomas heads up. And they do this thing called Wallcast. And the Wallcast is the concert that they're having inside. They actually cast outside on the wall, and they get about 2,000 people that come for these concerts free, and they picnic and they hang out, and then they go and they utilize everything that's happening in South Beach. But it's, you know, I think that creating a really vibrant master plan for downtown that is inclusive will then create these opportunities for future development that is community oriented. And I think it was an important point that Roger made.
Good point. Good point, both. Somebody else? I think of the Vienna Opera House. They have a big screen outside, and we picnic outside the Vienna Opera House and watch lots of performance. All good stuff. Okay, Tess.
All
back
right,
to you.
great. All right, so now you'll see on your screen council's direction for areas for consideration. And this was in the March council agenda report. The items that are underlined are items that we talked about during the last meeting. So things that have been added are parking, sustainability, infrastructure, and stormwater and drainage. I wanted to take a pause here just to make sure everybody's comfortable with these items. If there's anything else that you want to add, please feel free to do so. And we're going to go through each one right now in a little bit more detail. Okay. All right, so let's start with streetscape design and amenities. So what I'm hoping to do here is really go through each one and at a higher level, talk about what things you might want to see us either research or review, potentially have in the master plan, or at least have some acknowledgement there. So basic ones that I've put on the screen: design and layout, public spaces and facilities, outdoor dining. The Lincoln Road Miami example had more specifics when we talk about design elements. So looking at things like public seating or restaurant organization and infrastructure, paving, furnishing, just trying to throw out other ideas. What I want to do here is just, we're not going to necessarily have a conversation about, does one thing, you know, the bike and ped one is an example. Are we doing bikes or no bikes? We're going to save that for another discussion. But for this meeting, I want to talk about all the potential things that we want to at least research or identify in the plan. So I hope that helps.
Tess, the only thing that I would add to all of that, to the list that you had, was the potential for rezoning and any general plan amendments that might need to take place as a result of the master plan.
It's interesting you read it up, Marge, because when the council sent this on, they actually initiated all necessary zoning general plan amendments, specific plans necessary to carry it out. So they've given the legal authorities to do that. Good question, Diana.
Marge,
I'm
just
sorry.
as a follow-up. So when you're saying rezoning, are you thinking, you know, to incorporate other things that are not currently allowed downtown, or would you mind elaborating just a little bit there?
Well, I think that, you know, I think as a committee, I mean, in my perfect world, we would keep an open mind to what all the possibilities might be in terms of uses as we go through this process, and not put something aside simply because it isn't downtown. Because there may be a use that isn't currently allowed downtown that could be really a dynamic use.
You know, one of the things, again, just in the details, downtown is mainly C2, and the city has pyramid zoning. The only thing which is not allowed downtown is direct industrial use. All other uses are allowed within the C2 zone because of the pyramid zoning. Am I correct in that, Tess?
I believe so, yes, but different, you know,
Yeah.
I know housing is one example, so looking at different density and things like that could be something. of interest.
Yeah, it's interesting because most cities don't have pyramid zoning. It's an old concept, but actually it's
Dave-
today. Go
So
ahead.
Dave, I guess, so does that mean, and I'm certainly not a zoning expert, if with the pyramid zoning, would then someone have to come in for a conditional use permit for that use?
No, they're allowed all the other uses, the subordinate uses, residential, lesser commercial, they're all already allowed. They don't need CUPs. Only special things that need CUPs are called out in the CUP ordinance.
Okay,
Done.
thank you.
Diane.
So this wasn't what I was going to comment on, but maybe one of the things we need to look at is whether or not pyramid zoning is appropriate at this point in time, because we're getting a mix of uses that aren't necessarily working right now. And if left to each property owner's desire, we may not get what we want. So I'm not saying we shouldn't have pyramid zoning. I'm just thinking that it might be something we want to look at. What I was going to comment on was, Tess, I'm not sure if you're looking for what kind of detail we want to see in each of these elements. But the thing I noticed about every plan where the street was closed is that the street treatment was different. It didn't look like a street. And so I think we have to really directly address that if the street is going to remain closed, and I think it is. And lighting, I think, is hugely important. And I know those are things that we will address, but I think the more explicit we are now, probably the better.
Great, thanks, Diane. Yeah, that's exactly what I'm looking for. If there are certain things that you want to make sure are in this plan, because when we talk, you know, these are still pretty big items, like I've spoken with a lot of you on, and once you talk about streetscape design, for example, that can mean a lot of different things. So just trying to pull out what we want to focus on within each of these items. Any other thoughts here? Sure, Michael.
Thanks, Tessa. I think it would be in our interest to define our constraints relative to streetscape early on. Like, what is the fire department going to require? What is police going to require? Rather than plan something and have to revisit it later on. You know, does the fire department need 12 or 14 feet down the middle or what?
Great, yeah, great point. And we will, later on, I will get to that. I do want to have that discussion sooner than later.
I thought Ed raised his hand. Ed.
Yeah, one of the thoughts that go through my mind with our 13 block length is that, you know, a number of the plans that we saw, Santa Monica and Boulder and whatever, were much shorter blocks. And I'm wondering if we maybe shouldn't consider, as part of the direction we give to a planner, looking at shorter elements that may be interspersed with a conventional street. And it may be an approach that will give some health to each area that you wouldn't get out of a continuous 13 block run. The other thing that goes through my mind is that when you look at Santa Monica, they apparently got themselves up and running very, very quickly on a promenade, and how that was, I guess, made successful in getting up quickly was they did not eliminate the curb gutter situation. So when you walk down Third, you're on a street, but they've handled it in a manner which takes away the automobile out of the feeling of the street. And I think that is maybe something that we need to consider, maybe as a short term or a phase one versus a ultimate build out, so that we can get something going quickly on State Street that will encourage, you know, the city, the community, the property owners who want to see more. And I think that taking our design or having our designer show us what little bits and pieces, nibbling away at the approval process, however you want to look at it, maybe something that's worthwhile as well. I know I looked back at the charrettes that the AIA did, and they are grandiose, mammoth undertakings that are just, beyond, I think, the concept of being able to afford. And I think we ought to be careful about that so that we don't scare, the business owners, the taxpayers, whatever. So it's something I think we should consider. Maybe we look at this from a standpoint of 2 or 3 sections or whatever elements in planning. Thank you.
Robin,
Robin,
did you
go
want to go next?
Yes, thank you. One of the things that I thought might be important to include that was in the plan for San Luis Obispo was they had a concept plan and then they had an implementation plan, and who was the lead and supportive agencies or lead person and or organization for that implementation, as well as the cost. And if it was short-term or long-term, I think those might be very helpful in really making this go forward in a streamlined way. And then one other thing in regards to what member Lenvik was saying, one of the ways we may be able to do something quickly on the street to implement something would just be to paint sections of the street with kind of a public art painted treatment that could change every so often, not a chalk type thing, but more of a semi-permanent paint that would allow for a really significant change quickly. And there are textured versions of that allow for traction as well.
Great. Any other thoughts on streetscape design before we go to transportation? Yes, Roxana, and then Hillary.
Thank you, Ms. Harris. I also wanted to just put out there the counter opinion that although I strongly agree with the fact that we have to prioritize and figure out like how to program a plan of action, I think it's very important that we look at the big picture from the beginning. We make decisions from the bird's eye perspective of the entire area, even if we are not necessarily implementing all of that at once. That's by definition the idea of a master plan, is looking at the entire long-term range of the big picture. So I think it's very important that we don't just bite off small individual pieces, even though we might take those into steps that we're implementing, obviously for financial purposes, for timing, for permitting purposes, but to have the entire master plan's scope of work discussed and programmed would be very important upfront as we're working. I just wanted to put that out there. Thank you.
Thanks. All right. Yes, Hillary.
With regards to design and specifically amenities, I think the idea of street furniture and all the different flavors of that. So all, different kinds of seating. It won't just be benches, hopefully. And I know this sort of blends into transportation, but like real good bike parking, not hitching posts. So looking at all the different possibilities and opportunities for different levels of, the actual stuff on the street that is, more permanent, and really thinking about how that gets laid out and where it goes, how much of it, what it looks like, and all that, I think is important. And I would say with regards to outdoor dining, how much of that actual like tables and chairs infrastructure is public, available to, I forget who was saying, there was a city where you just go and you bring your own lunch and you can sit there, you don't have to pay to sit down, right? that kind of thing. What kind of things would we provide? And then what kind of guidance would be for private businesses if they have some amount of right of way? What kind of things could they have out there? So those are some things that come to mind.
Great. Any other thoughts before we move to transportation?
Just a general comment. Again, what we're looking at here is not the details of how we do things. What we're really talking about is in the development of the RFP. These are the elements we want people to address, to show us what they've done, to give us ideas of how we can address them. And then we're going to basically come down and get into the details later. But Tess really needs input as to, are there elements here that we're missing that should be in the RFP that we want to make sure we don't overlook when we put out that request for qualifications. Go ahead, Tess.
Thanks, Dave, for clarifying. Yeah, that's exactly what I'm looking for. And I want to make sure we get as much of this done. So that's why we haven't quite talked about the process yet for the RFP, RFQ, but that'll be up next during this meeting. But really what I'm trying to do is get as much information from all of you so I can create a scope or a project description. It still will be somewhat high level, but so that when we go out for bid, that somebody can respond and can have a meaningful response and really understand what we're looking for. So that's what I'm hoping to get from this. And this has been great so far. Yes, Peter.
So Tess, you and I spoke about when we met, but fundamentally, from somebody that builds downtown and repurposes buildings downtown, none of this is ever going to make a difference economically unless we deal very strategically with stormwater. And so that deals with your transportation, your surface materials, everything is going to pivot back to a economic and a design solution for stormwater. And as Ed knows, some of the stuff looks good on paper, but then all of a sudden, when we get to the structural challenges of dealing with retention and treatment, many ideas fail just right there at the door. So that really needs to be a material thing that is constantly understood and addressed.
Great. I certainly agree, Peter, and we'll have that. I do have one of the elements to address as stormwater and drainage, so we can chat through kind of more specifics on what we want there as well.
Tess, Ed has a comment, but before he gets there, I'm going to actually suggest that you run through these elements and then we can talk about what's missing, because we're 5:25 at this point. Ed, go ahead and then I'll give it back.
Yeah, I just want to, reinforce what was just said. The city has already decided we need to have more housing downtown. Not all of the street frontage buildings now have access on the back. A lot of them have access from the parking lots, but if they're going to go and add a second and third floor on top of a building downtown, you've got to be able to get utilities in to the street that aren't there now. You've got to be able to get materials into the front of that building. We've got to provide long-term for the growth up of downtown from the standpoint of housing. And it means we're going to have to respect the limited access that's available, and the fact that the streets are going to be, or the Paseo or whatever is going to be torn up simply to get utilities and infrastructure in for these buildings. So that's got to be kept in mind as well.
Good point.
Yes,
go ahead.
Let's
run through these points.
It looks
Go
like Suzanne had a comment she was hoping to make as well. Suzanne, if you can hear us, do you want to make your comment?
Yes, can you hear me? I unmuted
Yes.
myself.
We
Okay.
can. Yes.
No, I know these things have been touched upon and you might cover it as well, but I think understanding what is the public areas and what are the private areas in terms of what are the private restaurant dining, what is public. And I think public space, this street is going to be a public space to the main extent, and making that public space safe with appropriate lighting. And then also, I think there was a comment that somebody brought up as well in terms of providing enough public restrooms, and there's going to be a homeless issue. If we're going to provide benches, there are going to be people that are going to be there camping out. So these are all things that we need to consider. That's all I wanted to say at this point.
Great, thank you. Okay, so I'm going to run through the next few slides, and then if you can just hold your comments until the end, and if we don't quite get to everybody today, we can always come back to this the next meeting as well. So the next one is transportation, circulation, and parking. So looking at a discussion on walkability, bicycles, shuttles, vehicles, and parking. So how circulation is going to best operate on state, Chapala, and Anacapa, remembering that the geographic boundaries are from Chapala to Anacapa, and looking from SOLA to the underpass. And then looking at, maybe pedestrian zones or bike zones or shared space, opportunities for things like shuttles or not. Again, just to study various elements there. We'll move on next to equity and accessibility. So ensuring that we're catering and addressing the needs of a variety of our population. So various demographics, making sure that accessibility is a key component, and really acknowledging various users of the street. So looking at, from a disability perspective, how various users are able to access different structures or different components of the public spaced street. And then looking at from, accessibility from an older population to a youth population and everywhere in between. Looking at next, operation and maintenance. So when I think of operation and maintenance, a lot of things come up, but we could think about programming of the street, things like landscaping or janitorial services or cleaning, how to make sure that the space itself is safe and kept well so that users can continue to enjoy it. Public art, so incorporating and activating the street through a variety of public art elements. So, and this could even be by making infrastructure more artistic. So I think Hillary mentioned bike racks. I mean, there are examples of things like that that are more, that have a design component to them. Same with street lights, just kind of incorporating more of a whimsical feel in different elements of the street. Opportunities for seasonal installation. So right now we've got pianos on State. We've had a lot of other things pop up on State Street. So continuing that, but perhaps also thinking about more permanent public art infrastructure. And then this could be where we might want to think about, from an artistic perspective, do we want to incorporate some of those streetscape elements or design, like, having a public space, tables and chairs, or play space areas and things of that nature. So looking then to historic resources, make sure that we're acknowledging all of the various historic resources downtown. There's a wealth of them, really important to preserve the structures and various resources there. And then just making this plan an opportunity to highlight some of the exciting things that are downtown in Santa Barbara. And then from economic development, really looking at, or potentially looking at economic insights and a market position for the street, and what we see, the future of State Street being and what the health is currently. And then looking at funding strategies here. So perhaps reviewing various ways for funding programs and infrastructure. At this point, I want us still to have sort of to not let this limit us too much at this moment, so that we can try to put as many things on the table and then start to talk funding a little bit down the road. But I think it's going to be important for the plan to really address what funding components we're going to need in order to make the plan a reality. Lots of different ideas there, from bonds, general fund allocations, TOT increase, special assessment districts, business improvement districts, landscaping and lighting districts, transportation funds, a mix of public and private funding. Some of the example plans that I shared with you have some more details on funding. And then looking at homeless engagement, so acknowledging and addressing some of the current programs and partnerships that are already underway, like SB Act or lots of others in town as well. And then looking at different areas for opportunities when we think about homeless engagement and what things, what if any we want to address in this plan. And then same with housing and redevelopment influences, looking at existing programs. There was existing programs like the FAR discussion that's currently underway and just recently went to the Planning Commission. But then also looking at different opportunity areas and whether there are different opportunities downtown for increased housing. Also, sustainability infrastructure. This was one that was added by the State Street Advisory Committee. So really thinking about the future, considering energy efficiency, climate resilience. I mean, one of the things I think that's really interesting about the Paris example that I presented was the focus is on pedestrians, but it's also on making the city itself a greener, more climate resilient city by incorporating a lot more landscaping to change emissions from that perspective. And then stormwater and drainage. So Peter mentioned this one. This one's going to be really important to touch on as well. But considering looking at existing infrastructure and how this public, space or how this area could perhaps complement it. And then looking at providing some stormwater benefits or stormwater infrastructure components more than what exists today in a public space or what that potential could be. So those are all the ones that we talked about as a group. The other things that I would just offer as areas for this group to consider are things like public outreach and input, making sure, we talked about the Burlington plan. That's probably the biggest highlight from that plan is really I think they went really beyond what most plans do in a great way. So I would encourage that we think about a really strategic public outreach effort and making sure that we get public input throughout the process. I know, some of us have had conversations individually about ensuring that we're getting, Roger and I, for example, had a discussion about ensuring that we're reaching out to children. Some of the younger population could be college students or high school students or elementary students, but making sure that we're not forgetting about that's just an example, but making sure we're not forgetting about different populations that perhaps aren't with us in this setting. And then making sure that we have an implementation plan. So how to address, all of the conceptual design elements that we might want to put forward and what that plan is going to look like. And potentially looking at phasing of the plan. So perhaps, years X through X, we're focused on this, and that might be something we want to consider or may not. And then also long-term maintenance and operations. So just again, back to kind of the programming component, just making sure that we're looking at the operational side of the street. So I'm going to pause there. And that is going to end the first item before we get into B, the RFP, RFQ process. Maybe we can just
let's see if there's any other comments on any of those items. Ken, go ahead.
Thanks, Dave. I wanted to go back to Michael's comment about a SWOT analysis. And one of the things that struck me that's not really in your slides, Tess, is really something with a marketing edge that really says, what is unique about Santa Barbara? And then what is the unique role that downtown plays in the Santa Barbara region? So because we're not going to be able to do everything. So we want to take the investments that we make and really, I think, put them behind our greatest, assets, and in particular to build on those. I know in the Santa Monica plan there was there's a real sense as to what's different about Santa Monica from all these other downtown areas in the LA region and play to that differentiation. So I just wanted to put that out as something that I think that I'd like to see this plan include to some extent.
It's a really good point. a really good point. That SWOT analysis is something which I think is baseline. We have to do that and to basically call out. Other comments? Nadra?
Really, thank you. Just to build upon two of the cities that, in terms of Copenhagen and Austin, that really stuck out was the idea of a brand. To Ken's point, is really that what is unique about Santa Barbara and codifying that into what is our brand and fusing that in the plan. And also the idea pulling from Austin is the values, because having a brand and having a set of values that we're building this master plan will help with the cohesion in terms of any execution or implementation of the ideas that we want to put forth.
Good points. Really good points. Okay. Mike, or actually Alejandra and then Michael. Alejandra, go ahead.
Thank you, Chair. I just wanted to thank you for pointing out the values and kind of our vision here, because as I was listening to the slides, housing the homeless issue came up, and seeing how there's proposal for arts and places to sit on State Street. And I see it now in parks and different public spaces. There isn't a place to sit down. And there's a lot of, grandmas and people with disabilities that kind of need to rest when they're around the city. But I understand some of the purposes to remove the homeless. But I think I think establishing those values are going to be really important, and our vision for State Street, because everybody knows that what's happening now. I mean, we don't really have a grip with the homeless issue, and it's a lot bigger than the city. But we really have to be very realistic and propose maybe something to council specifically for State Street, and that other areas in the city can model, because we won't be able to have benches or artwork if the homeless issue continues on State Street. I mean, the business owners are already having a hard time just keeping that area, their business fronts clean in the morning. So I just want to ask the group, we really have to be realistic when it comes down to these issues that are very sensitive, and I understand, but we have to be courageous and leaders to be very realistic with the public. So that's it, Chair. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Michael.
Thank you, Chair. Just reiterating 2 quick points from Tess that I really appreciate. Number one is the equity issue, that if we want this to be downtown Santa Barbara, we have to engage the entirety of the city. And there's no pockets of the population that can be ignored. That we have to go far and wide in getting input into this plan. And second, Tess also mentioned the kids. I really, that's kind of what interested me in getting involved with this is going to take 2 or 3 years to go through this process, then 10 or 15 years to fully implement the plan. And I think just with that, I think at least I recognize that this is not about me. This is about what's the Santa Barbara for my children, and what's, what do they need in 15, 20 years, and not the way that I want to see Santa Barbara now. It's, what would be the beneficial Santa Barbara for my children? And I think that's kind of my focus looking forward. But I appreciate Tess bringing that up.
Good, great. Hillary.
Agree with Michael. I want to be the old lady looking for the bench, right, to sit on when this is all implemented. Hopefully, I don't have to look too hard for it. A few things, Tess, on the slides. I think on the climate piece, sort of adaptation and resilience, looking at, sort of shade more than trees, right? Because if you think about right now, the shadiest part of the street is on the sidewalk, but if we open the middle up, not so much, depending on time of day. Obviously, buildings will change that. I think on the public art piece, I don't know if this is sort of clarified in the scope, or if we just need to have a hard discussion about it on this committee. But, you know, public art is amazing. I think we should have more murals. I think they should be interesting and cool and all kinds of public art. But things that are interesting and cool and aren't based on Spanish colonial design, like, are sort of like dead on arrival. So hopefully that's something that can change, but we need to be realistic about that with what the city's sort of structure is at this point with advisory committees. On the transportation piece, I know it said shuttles and vehicles. I think since we're saying State Street, but we're also sort of taking Chapala and Anacapa into consideration. I think it should sort of be transit writ a little bit larger than just shuttles, because who knows what the actual vehicle will be like, but something of how people can get around on transit. And then the thing I forgot to mention on the streetscape is parades. Of course, we need to know if a fire truck can get down, but what about our parades? So needing to plan for that. We haven't had any in a couple of years, so it's easy to forget. And then with regards to outreach, has to be deep and wide, and we can't just, you know, say, well, we did a survey, you didn't get the email, which I know we won't. I liked in the San Luis Obispo plan their outreach examples, and they did things with kids. Kids were like drawing what they liked about a certain part of downtown, which I thought was cool. So I think there's a lot of opportunities to do outreach of all kinds of folks, and I think we'll all feel better at the end of this if we do a great job on outreach.
Great.
Great,
Marge.
thank you.
Marge.
So thank you, Chair Davis. I couldn't agree more. When Tess and I met, I one of the first things I said to her was the importance of facilitated community meetings. This downtown master plan really needs to be something that will be inclusive for everyone that lives here. And we know who the immediate stakeholders are, right? Property owners, businesses downtown, but really the stakeholders are the people that live here and the people that we want to come downtown. And so I think, you know, having a couple of facilitated community meetings right up front make a lot of sense prior to hiring a consultant to get that feedback. For better or worse, I think it's really, really important. And I think that it sends a message to the community that we want this to be about our community, the greater community of Santa Barbara.
Great.
And if I could follow up on that.
Go ahead, Kristen.
Again, we may not have to decide this today, and it's okay if we decide differently, but I would posit that really this downtown is the whole South Coast's downtown. So people who live in Goleta consider this our downtown. People who live in Carpinteria, it's a little different, but we don't have to ask, we don't have to reach out to those communities on every single question, but I would think it's valuable to decide, do we want to use this as an opportunity to reach out that way to cast a wider net for residents and businesses at some point in the process to talk about this major transformation that we're talking about making, and it will affect all of us on the South Coast.
Thank you. Roxana.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chair. I would love to piggyback off of Ms. Miller. I think she's singing my song. It's something that I keep saying, and now that I've heard it, I just want to grab it and say it again. For me, I think it's extremely important and very valuable to our efforts to make sure that everyone who uses our downtown, whether it's regularly or semi-regularly, has input. Because there are people who live, you know, half a mile over the city limit line, and they are using, you know, crossing that invisible line and using the city every single day. And there's people who live, 10 miles outside of that invisible line. They may be residents of Goleta or Nolita, right across the the line, or even, as you mentioned, Carpinteria, who drive in or commute in by other forms of transportation every single day. And they use our city, our downtown, our uptown, just as much as anyone who lives in the city. In fact, people who live in the city might be commuting to Goleta for their daily life. So I think it's very, very important that we do consider these people, that they are a part of this process. And in my previous work, I was working daily with students who were using, they were completely dependent on our bus lines, our MTD transportation. And they had a lot to say about this issue because they wanted to stay in downtown. Their school was in downtown, but their buses would leave to Carpinteria or to Goleta around 5:30 or 6, and they couldn't miss that bus, but they wanted to stay downtown. They wanted to dine downtown. They wanted to interact and use the nightlife or to go shopping, and their day was cut short. And I just think about all the revenue that we missed out on because people had to rush to get on that bus or to get, home. And I think that is a big part of this process. How do we keep people downtown? How do we make sure people are able to have choices to use their downtown and to make sure that they have a voice in the process? Thank you, Ms. Miller, for bringing it up. I'm really glad I could grab it and emphasize it some more. Thank you.
Thank you. Ed?
Yes, I want to just remind everyone that we have an investment of 50 to 75 years in the character of downtown now. It is in our historic district, and buildings have been designed and built and remodeled and occupied and abandoned and whatever for all these years, always coming back to the style that was decided upon in the late 20s, early 30s, and has been entombed in our charter. And I think a lot of people who are tourists who come to Santa Barbara have come to Santa Barbara because of the character of our downtown, and they really enjoy it. Whether or not the residents here appreciate that or not, I don't know. A lot of times developers and businessmen don't appreciate that. But when you look at what smart businessmen are building outside of the downtown area, whether it's on the west side or wherever, smart businessmen are a lot of times building in this Santa Barbara Mediterranean character. And I think that we've already got a good start on what a urban planner might want to work with in the character that is downtown now, and to build on that. If you look at the old parts of Paris or Rome or whatever people have mentioned today, they're living with old buildings and they are building on that character that's there. And I think we've got to make sure that we have our planner keep that in mind as he starts to develop, or she, whoever starts developing a scheme for State Street, is that we've already got a lot of character built in, and we don't want to abandon that for something new and glitzy. And some of the planning documents we saw, I don't even recall whether they were Burlington or Boulder or whatever, they were really glitzy, really nice stuff that can entice people to maybe look at a different direction. And I'm not sure that's what we want to have accomplished here. So I want to keep that in mind as we move ahead.
Okay, it's 5:49 I have, and we're really getting down to it. I'm going to do two things before Tess goes through the thing. I'm going to ask the clerk whether anyone wishes to speak on this item. We have anyone from the public who has wished to speak on item A, the master planning scope and key elements.
Thank you. Just as a reminder, if you do wish to make public comment, please use the raise hand icon on your control panel. I'll call on you and you will have 2 minutes to speak. No one has raised their hand and indicated that they would like to make a public comment.
Great, thanks. Tess, do you want to close out on talking about the tentative process from here? All these elements we'll be back talking about again, and we'll be able to draft actually coming back on an RFP at some point. And then before we get into our last item, the interim operations. Go ahead, Tess.
Yes, so really quickly, I'm going to go through the RFP or RFQ process. This is a process, if you're not as familiar with some of the longer term planning projects or processes, this is really common in a long range type planning project. But some of the things that a consultant could help us with are just from the basics, the conceptual design layout for what we're talking about to help us form reactions to different design ideas. Working on some of the technical studies that we might need to have in order to complete the master planning effort. And then the last three are things that could really help complement staff. So in terms of public outreach programming and facilitation of some of these meetings or other meetings, and then assessment of the existing infrastructure, existing conditions. I fully expect that myself and another planner that'll be joining me will be working on those elements, but having a consultant as well to assist in that effort, I think will be helpful because it's a large project.
Yeah, now just two quick comments. One, we've talked a lot, we've mentioned it a number of times today, a SWOT analysis. And a SWOT analysis encompasses existing conditions and whatever, but it's broader than that. And so we're going to want to look at a SWOT analysis for sure. And going to Marge's point, any consultant that we would even consider would have to show us a robust public participation process, which is totally inclusive of the community and region in that regard, as well as the immediate stakeholders. So those are just keys. Go ahead.
Great, thanks, Dave. So I now want to just go through a sort of broad timeline of just to set expectations for what the process could look like from right now through the RFP to selecting a consultant. So over the next month or so, I'll be drafting a scope of work based on the discussion that we've had today. And I can come back to this group. Oops, give me one moment. I can come back to this group in November or December. You'll see we have some other ideas for the November meeting, so that's why you're seeing December on this slide here. And then we would anticipate that the RFP or RFQ, so request for proposal or qualifications, would open and be available for 30 to 45 days. So likely, given the holidays, I would expect it probably opens in the new year and is open January, February, would close in February, and then we would have a selection process, and that would be in coordination with the chair and vice chair to review the responses that we've received, select the finalists, and then interview the finalists at that point. So this is a fairly aggressive timeline, but depending on the number of finalists, I'm giving it about a month for the interviewing process and selecting the finalists. And then we would finalize a scope of work at that point. So both Mr. Davis and Mr. Saxon and myself and other staff on the team would negotiate with the consultant and update a more detailed scope of work. So right now I'm suggesting somewhat of we have elements in the scope of work, and then the consultant can respond to it, provide their input and insight, what they see might work or not work. And then we can have more of a dialogue around what that final scope of work should look like with a little more granular scale. And then we would take the contract to City Council for approval. That would be early to mid 2022. And then I'm anticipating that a consultant would be selected and join around May of 2022. And we'd be in full progress at that point on the master planning effort with them on board. Does anybody have any questions on that timeline?
My only question, Tess, would be on the RFP, RFQ. Depending upon the amount of detail we want them to put into the RFP itself, 45 days may be short. So that may be 45 to 60 days. If we're really, it's going to depend upon what our scope looks like. But if we really want them to do due diligence and bring us, after they've done detailed intelligence gathering in the community, 45 days, Diane, you've done a lot of work in this regard. 45 days is pretty quick. You're going to get just boilerplate stuff. So I'm thinking 45 to 60 days on the RFP, RFQ. Diane, any comment? You're muted.
Yeah, I think 45 days is quick if it's somebody talking. I'm not sure who. Anyway, I think the 45 days is short, Dave. If it's going to be an RFP, I don't think it really ought to be an RFQ if we're going to get into the type of detail that we want to. And I would think that the committee would want to be involved with that. And if we do an RFQ, it looks like it's really going to be just the chair and vice chair. And I think we need a bit broader level of input. So I vote for RFP and maybe lengthening the time a little bit.
Any other thoughts on the process?
Okay.
So one other comment, I know somebody suggested that we start public outreach now. I think that would require that Tess do it. And I'm not sure that that's completely realistic given everything else she's trying to do. So I think it would be great if we could start it, but it sounds like that would be pretty difficult.
I was going to make, Marge. I was going to make the same comment. I was thinking that part of the thing that you want the consultant to do is basically to bring together a detailed public participation process, which will start with public facilitation throughout the community, involving all the stakeholders, the committees, the council, all the boards and committees. It's based upon like other general plan, specific plan type things like this. You're talking about a 6 to 8 month public participation process, really detailed and out in the community. So I had the same reaction.
And just jumping off that, I've had that, different thoughts on public outreach. I do think, we'll want to talk about when we want to start that process, but regardless, if we do want to start that process ahead of bringing a consultant on board, I would just really encourage that we wait until after the holiday time. November and December, just a lot of people aren't around or just aren't really as in tune with what's going on. And I think we could miss an opportunity if we decide to have things there. So I would just suggest that we look at starting that outreach process earlier in the new year. If we want to do it sooner than later.
I'll also throw in the fact that we will have also the interim standards in operations, which will be going back to council in March. And we will want to engage the public possibly before then on those items, and the master plan being something which will follow in the master plan process itself. So there really are 2 tracks which we're looking at in that regard. Okay, we're getting down to time here, Tess. We're on 5:58.
Chair Davis,
So-
I need to interject here.
Go ahead, Aria.
There's no lawful way without sacrificing your exemption from the Political Reform Act for the committee to negotiate with the consultants or to reduce the list down to a single consultant. All of those decisions need to be either made by staff or council. You can certainly make recommendations as to which consultant, but you can't make the decision as to which the final will be.
Yeah, I think that was the intent to do that. Yes, go ahead.
Great, thanks for the clarification. Greta, do we have any public comment at this time for item B for the RFP/RFQ process?
I'm just looking at the panel. No one has raised their hand to make a public comment. Just a reminder, if you'd like to make public comment, please click the hand icon on your control panel. And I'll call on you. We have no raised hands. Thank you.
Great, thank you. All right, so going into the next item quickly here. So the interim operations and management. I'm just going to spend a moment on this. We plan to come back next in November to really dive a little bit deeper on this process. And I envision that while we're working on the scope of work for the larger master planning effort, we'll be talking about this interim period. So one of the things we'll look to talk about in November is discussing the replacement for the Emergency Economic Recovery Ordinance, an extension or replacement of what currently exists. And that can be an opportunity to talk about some of the draft language of the replacement ordinance, get feedback and ideas going there. And then also getting feedback in November on different ideas or opportunities for what we can do in this space in that interim period. That doesn't necessarily mean that the ordinance needs to touch on all the different things that we might want to do. There are things, ways that we can address different areas of the street without it needing to tie directly into the ordinance. But before November's meeting, I would just encourage you all to really think about what is or isn't working right now on the street that would need to be addressed sooner than this master planning effort. So if there's something that you feel we want to start to really think about in this interim period, to be prepared in November to have that discussion. Are there any questions on that right now?
I think we had talked, Tess, that it was possible there might be 2 meetings, that we might have talked about some of the items in November and some other items in December, and actually even come back in January for a summation before it goes to council.
Yes, thank you, Chair Davis, for that reminder. So this next slide just shows you some thoughts on what the future meeting topics could be for November and December. So the replacement ordinance, opportunities in this interim, and then potentially doing some group facilitation. Mr. Saxon has discussed with us just having that conversation and discussion. I know it was brought up during the last meeting, and I think it would be good for us to make sure that we all have a collective set of principles moving forward. So that's the thought for November. In December, really starting to talk about circulation, public safety, the location of the closure, and potentially the underpass project on State Street. Looking ahead, some of the items we've thought of so far, talking about stormwater, parklets, or outdoor dining and street cleaning, potentially in January. And then in February, talking about some of the projects that are currently underway, the Library Plaza, De La Guerra Plaza, the Farmers Market relocation to Carrillo Street, and then Paseo integration. And then we'll sort of transition into some of the topics that we discussed for the master plan from there.
I think I thought Mr. Jordan raised his hand at one point. Was I mistaken there? I saw a hand.
This is the real Mike Jordan, not the other lurker that's in the crowd. That's Oscar. He's next door. Hey, Tess, I'm just wondering if you can find some way maybe to prime the pump on those November things. So it would be interesting to me, it'd be an overview of the new order from the governor, extending it till whatever, 2050 or whatever, and what that means. And maybe next Saturday we can work on that too, but you might have some ideas or other people might feed you some ideas. My example would be TVs hanging on the outside of buildings at 1.5 floors high as something that's rather immediate to address. That would just be my opinion, but maybe you could get some of those things before the November meeting and just feed people with some examples to think about as you like, you don't like, and these are the kind of things.
Certainly. Yeah, great feedback there. Yes, Robin, I think I saw your hand raised.
Can you share a little bit more feel for how much time we're potentially talking about in this interim phase? Are we talking about all of the time until all of this master plan is implemented, or just until we have the master plan written or designed out? I'm just kind of curious as to how much time we want to be talking about in the next 2 months and what all we should be really addressing sooner than later, because there's a big scope of potential time we might be talking about here.
Sure. Yeah, it's a great point. So it could be that full spectrum of from now until when the master plan is implemented, certainly. But I would think of it, when you're thinking about it, planning can change. We can change the idea or design or thought process, right, for what we want to do. So I would encourage us to think about simpler things that we can test and try and implement more easily, and then see if they work and use that to guide us in the master planning process, or see if they don't work. We can look at larger infrastructure components as well. but we'll just have to keep in mind that putting larger infrastructure things in is likely not going to be something that we would then want to pull out, as a result of the master planning effort. So that's where, sort of the line would be drawn. But again, it's really that interim phase, and it could be years, it could be years.
Yeah, let me interject and say, we have this ordinance that's going to expire in March, and they're going to have to extend and do something, right? So you're going to have 2.0 coming up in March. My guess is, and Tessa's kind of alluded to it, there'll be a 3.0 at some point in the future as conditions have changed, be it the pandemic, or be it the economic conditions, be it the council, be it the economic conditions. So I think we're going to go right now looking at a 2.0 starting in March, heading into the completion of the master plan process. Definitely be a 3.0 after that, if the plan basically is adopted but not fully implemented and roll out. But there could be interim things where we come back and check in.
Thank you for that, Chair Davis. And yes, I would, to kind of keep our minds all kind of on the same page, I would really think about it as, now until sort of the end of 2023, perhaps, or that sort of target frame of we're working on this master plan and what are we doing in that period between now and when that's done. Because it could be much longer than that, but that gives us a sense of what we can do right now. Yes, Ms. Blackerby?
Yeah, one thing about, there was a mention of like, do we start public outreach before we, have a consultant or whatever? And I agree, that's a very heavy lift. What I would say, however, is this is our third meeting, right? And I think maybe across 3 meetings, one person has given public comment from the public. So I think in some ways we're sort of failing already on public outreach, because they should be watching us and giving feedback on what we're saying and all of that from the public. So when you're talking about the process of doing any public outreach around the holidays, I would say, first of all, December taking on one of the biggest beasts, which is transportation, on the 3rd Monday of the month or whatever in December. I want a ton of people from the community to be on that meeting, telling us what they think, what they want to see, what they hate, what they love. In this process right now, as we're sort of making decisions about our scope and our project and the plan, and that seems like a rough time to get any engagement. Not saying we shouldn't have a meeting, but sort of these more, dry topics about ordinances and things like that. Maybe we want to handle something like that in December and then really kick off in earnest. So what I would say is, one, I'm interested in, and I, will commit as a committee member to doing more outreach personally to get more people to engage in these meetings now that they're sort of on more, let's say, interesting or engaging topics. But I think it's something we all should do. And the city, through their channels, it would be helpful if some sort of like, hey, this is happening, weigh in. And once Zoom is our platform, it's going to be so much easier for people to participate. So anyway, I just wanted to put that out there as we start to look at the advanced calendar.
Great, that's a good segue to the last item. Anybody have any comments there before we move on?
The only comment, again, just we looked at the fact that the council is looking for input on what the next interim ordinance will look like, and we backed that out. The fact that they need our comments by February, that gives us November, December, and January to cover everything. So that's the time we have to deal with, at least to get any input to council in time for them to consider it in late February and March. Okay, let's go on to item C, potential items for future meetings. Oh, any public comment? I'm sorry, Greta, on this particular item.
No problem. If you have public comment that you'd like to make at this time, please click the hand icon once. I'll call on you to speak. And no one has indicated that they would like to make public comment.
Okay, great. Tess, you want to close us out?
Great. So the final item, really hoping to talk about is just agenda items for future meetings. And we touched on that a little bit in the last item. But I want to just get thoughts here on, making sure that everybody is on the same page with what we're coming back with in November. If we want to table the December topics, we can do that and have that discussion in November. I recognize that the December meeting right now is scheduled for December 20th. So I don't know what the committees, how many of you will be able to participate at that time, but certainly if you don't feel like you will be able to, please send me an email sooner than later so that we can look at that date. So for the November date, right now we have tentatively scheduled the replacement of the Emergency Economic Recovery Ordinance and talking about what's in that draft language or what's in that replacement ordinance. And then some group facilitation, potentially led by Ken. And then opportunities in this interim phase, starting to have the discussion of what things we might want to get further clarification on and have further conversations about. Is there anything else, Chair Davis, that you'd like to add, or anybody else?
No, not for me at this point. Anybody else? Okay, great. Thank you, Tess. Productive meeting, but I think we're really going to hit the ground running next month for sure. Ken, you and I can talk about the prelim on how we're going to engage the committee next time, and everybody have a great month. We'll call this meeting adjourned.
Chair, one moment before we call it adjourned, we actually do need to take public comment for that last, for the future agenda items. So
Okay, I don't consider that to be an action item by the committee, so you don't have to take public comment on a non-action item. Ariel can weigh in on that, but it's just essentially talking about our future agendas. So that's why I skipped it. Ariel, if you want to comment on that? He's not there.
Action's not a prerequisite for public comment, Chair Davis.
Yeah, so Greta, anybody wants to speak on that?
No one has raised their hand to make public comment. Thank you.
Okay. I'm gonna call it at 6:12. Okay, thank you, everybody.
thank you, everyone.
Thanks all.
Thank you. Good night.